Good evening. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to see you all. Know you all are there. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Artists and Inspiration program, bringing Indigenous perspectives into museums. I'm Ann Van Ingen. I'm co-chair of the Board of Trustees of the Adirondack Experience. And I'd like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and lifeways. We hope this new year finds you all in good health. At the Adirondack Experience, we're looking at 2022 as a year of new possibilities and new experiences, and we are very excited about this upcoming season. We look forward to opening our doors to all of our members and friends on May 27th for a full season. Museum staff are working hard on building this full season of new programs and the return of fan favorites, of course. So look for season updates on the website later this spring. So tonight, for this evening's seminar, I am thrilled to introduce a member of the ADKX's own family, our Board of Trustee member, Scott Manning Stevens. Scott earned his BA at Dartmouth and his MA and PhD at Harvard University. He's a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and is coming to us this evening from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he's currently a fellow of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. He's the director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University and will shortly be taking the reins of the newly established and quite extraordinary Center for Global Indigenous Cultures and Environmental Justice at Syracuse University. Our congratulations, Scott. This is a wonderful thing. So throughout Scott's presentation, which is about to start, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Scott will take questions after the presentation. So Scott, I turn it over to you now. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nyawa Goa. Sego Skanago to everyone. That is a Mohawk greeting saying that I hope it is still a great peace with you. And I greet you, as Anne said, from the Wampanoag traditional territories of the coast of New England. Delighted to be here tonight. Cold night here, probably where everyone else is as well. But I'm just really happy to be part of this new year of Adirondack Experience programming, and our focus tonight is on bringing Indigenous experience into the museum. And I'm going to just bear with me while I share my screen here and start with a PowerPoint, which I've created for this event. So a great part of my academic work is focused on some of the problems endemic to museums, galleries, archives, as they relate to Native America. And these stretch back all the way to the origins of the museum, whether it was as a cabinet of curiosities, where indigenous cultures of the Americas material culture was collected for its exoticism, or whether it was under the pseudoscience of race during the 19th century, which created the persistent racial hierarchies that we struggle under to this day. Museums have always been part of that problem, but also are endeavoring now to be part of that solution and really get ahead of that by opening up the dialogue to Indigenous voices. Arguably, it's very belated and we should have been there from the get-go, but better late than never, as they say. So what is this problem to which I refer as the basis, and how do we hope to correct it? Well, one is simply in placement, right? That it wasn't necessarily in an art museum that you would encounter Native American or Indigenous works of art, but rather you would see them as artifacts in a natural history museum. And I have been keenly aware since I was a child who had parents that took me to museums, that there was a discomfort around the juxtaposition of things like dinosaurs and mastodons and things extinct with Native American culture, usually on the other side of the room or down the hall. It was simply the kind of positioning that put these things in proximity to each other that always made me uneasy, right? Why didn't I see aspects of Haudenosaunee or Iroquois culture celebrated and represented in history museums as much as I did in natural history museum, right? And again, there's a long tradition with natural history museums and their presentation of ethnic others, where the normative viewer is always presumed to be white, right? You don't see a lot of vitrines and dioramas with European people doing European things. It's usually, you know, the tribesmen of Africa or Australia or North America and South America. And so this uneasy juxtaposition, the dinosaur and the Indian, has confronted me since I was a kid. And these are recent photos, these things have not gone away. They're not part of my childhood. They're part of a lot of people's childhoods to this day. This is a photograph from the Field Museum that I took in the early 2000s. And I've been, again, you take a vibrant and rich cultural heritage like that of the Potawatomi people and render it relatively inert when it's frozen in this vitrine, faceless, motionless, just one of many. And remember the effect of this when there are 20 or 30 such figures in a room is that they simply look like taxidermied animals or decorations. You think of hordes of school children being, ushered through these buildings year after year and wonder how much is actually conveyed to them by the displays that they're being shown. And another reason that I'm particularly interested in museums around the field of Native America, and those of you who know me will know that I harp on this issue a lot, but it hasn't gone away, so I'll continue banging on that door, that in the United States, the average age nationally at which people stop learning about Native America in school is fourth grade. Now, that is a remarkable and sad fact. If you take into the fact that there's so much to learn and what is being taught to someone of that age, right? Usually a very sanitized version of the encounter and conflict between Native America and European settlers, right? Stories tend to emphasize people getting along or celebrating that connection, such as the Thanksgiving Day story, the Pocahontas story, the Squanto story, the Sacagawea story. These are the stories that young children are given. They make the conquest and settlement of the Americas seem like a pleasant enough experience. And they do, besides doing that work to whitewash the violence of that history, they also put Native America in the distant past. We're somehow the first act of America, and we're ushered off the stage, never to be heard from again thereafter. To the extent that children grow up thinking there are no more Native communities. They're probably not aware that there are 8 reservations in upstate New York alone, and they're not aware of Native cultures as vibrant, identifiable, and culturally distinct cultures in the present. And again, as I said, fourth grade, that's a long period to go without any formal education. In some states, there's a revisit in seventh grade because of their state history courses, again, cover some of the same ground on Native America, but more specifically for their home state. And that was true in New York when I was a boy. But again, it's very much about the past. We learn about the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy in the first part of the seventh grade curriculum because we're at the beginning of history, but we somehow get lost in the midst of it. So nothing about our service during the Civil War or subsequent world wars and so on, nothing about resistance to different political issues during the 19th and early 20th century. All that is gone. So why museums? I guess to me, I think museums have a special burden on their shoulders, whether they like it or not, of being one of the sole places of authority, of cultural and educational authority, that people might go to get information, hopefully correct, about Native American culture. But as I said, usually what greets them is this familiar, what we call a declension narrative. We were 100% of the population in 1491, and then we have declined ever since with the presumption of extinction at the end of the road. That's what we call a declension narrative or a terminal narrative. And museums often do this just by, kind of association, things like the dinosaur, the mastodon, um, the distant past, the focus on a presumed authentic native culture, which makes inauthentic our presence in the contemporary world. Put your mind around that for a moment, right? That can't be good psychologically for any native person, especially our young people, to be told you're not a real Indian if you're still living in the present. We don't want a situation that is saying the only real Indian is a dead Indian. And yet, some museums have underscored that, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly for decades. I started with the Field Museum because I lived in Chicago for a number of years in the early 2000s, but this is closer to home. You may be aware of this story about the old New York diorama at the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. Um, came about 2018, 2019, just before the pandemic broke out, that people began to be uneasy about the way that encounter between the Dutch settlers and the Lenape people was being portrayed in one of the vitrines in the entry hall, called Old New York. These are dating back to the 1930s. And the entry hall was meant to celebrate things that related to the life of Teddy Roosevelt. So you wonder, well, how would this scene relate to Teddy Roosevelt? But because of his Dutch ancestry, his Dutch settler ancestry, and his connection with the New York City region, they start with Peter Stuyvesant, and here you have a version of him encountering Lenape men and women, coming to pay him tribute, as it were. Now, one of the things the museum did was, rather than get rid of the um, vitrine altogether or take it down and correct it, they invited a native historian or historians to look at this image and think what they would want people to know when looking at it. And then they made these new kind of superimposed labels that they attached directly to the glass of the vitrine, so that if you were to go to see it today, you would read just what you're seeing on the right hand side, where it says reconsidering this scene. We'd also talk about the way the women are undressed in the background and look like just servants. We talk about European desires for land, etc. But this is, they did turn to people from the Lenape community and the Stockbridge Munsee community, um, and ask, what are your concerns about this? Of course, short of taking it down altogether or rebuilding it in a more accurate way, I think this is one sign of a coming and increasing concern about these things. Now, this isn't necessarily just to pretty something up and say, well, I don't like colonialism, so I don't want this referred to. It's not about that. It's about getting it correct. Getting, again, the kind of usual peacefulness of colonialism is what's represented by the colonizers, but usually not on the minds of those colonized. Um, Further along, we have a museum I was more familiar with as a kid. I was sometimes taken to the New York State Museum in Albany, and you know, to this day, the very things I remember from really early childhood, maybe 6 or 7 years old, the mastodon, and then right around the corner from him, the longhouse, and how these things, like my dinosaur with the Indian, were juxtaposed in a way that always made me uneasy. Still there, they have, to be sure, better signage, better interpretive stance. I think there are good people there that I've encountered in the last few years working on, changing some of these exhibits to bring them up to date in terms of scholarship, in terms of native input. But by all means, there's a lot, there's a lot to be corrected. I think somewhat infamous is this decades old, and I remember this again as a kid, diorama, which is still there. And I could only think back to, the embarrassment Native children were made to feel when seeing this display of topless Native women. It's not explained that this is particularly historically or anthropologically accurate. It is just presumed that it is. Um, and the expectation that thousands of school children would walk by this without it being a sight of, laughter and joking and so on. I don't think they learn a lot about Haudenosaunee agriculture from this vitrine. I think there's a lot of, nudge, nudge, and like, oh, is that your mom, Scott? That type of thing goes on with. I do really pity Native kids that have to suffer those visits to the New York State Museum. And I've asked, various people, is this correct? So in our climate, our buggy, hot in the summer, cold in the climate, cold in the winter climate, women went topless? I don't see it in representations from the 17th century or hear it discussed. So I think of it as more of a kind of 19th century bleed over about primitivism as much as it is anything accurate about the anthropology of that space. But it's things like that that just endure forever. So I can't, walk through the museum today without still wincing when I see this and know that that's there. It's going to always be there if the same people have their way about it. I have no problem, discussing the history. We have an ancient history here, and New York State's geographic shape, cartological shape, is largely due to the shape of our Confederacy and the territories that it controlled. But I do have a problem when museums act as though that's when life stopped, that in 1720, before were conquered by the end of the American Revolution, 1783, that after that, as I said, we're off the stage. I would love students to be aware of this map of our many reservations throughout the region. As I said, one's in New York State, but also in southern Quebec and in southern Ontario. So my mother's reserve is this one, Akwesasne, right up here on the US-Canadian border. We have plenty of family that have come from or lived in Ganawage or even Ganasatake, Deyandanega. My maternal grandfather was from Six Nations, though also Mohawk, my grandmother being from Akwesasne Mohawk. So there's a real kind of diaspora of Ginyangihaga or Mohawk people alone, plus the other 5 nations, right? The Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Tuscarora, and Seneca, stretching from east to west. There is a large Oneida reservation out in Green Bay, Wisconsin, because a group of them emigrated to that region in the 1820s, thinking that would be far enough away from white desires for indigenous land. And so there they remain to this day, though they do have a small reservation in New York State that you might know right off the thruway. So I always want people to be aware of this as much as they are this. This is historical. This is, important to all Haudenosaunee people. But this is the reality of our bounded lives on reservations today and where our communities call home. Now, you may know that almost half of Indigenous people in the United States do not live on their home reservations. That's largely due to work and economics, that they aren't places where there's a lot of opportunity work-wise. So we often live in nearby cities like Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, New York, all have significant Haudenosaunee communities, as do places like Montreal and Toronto in Canada. So what is do I see any light in this tunnel? I do, and I've been happy to have the experience of working with people involved in making some really significant changes that I think are extremely important to museums. I think they're important to the way we go forward. And one is that the Adirondack experience itself. I became, before I was a board member, I was first involved as one of a group of people advising on their restructuring of a permanent exhibit that's called Life in the Adirondacks. And they were including, belatedly, a whole section on Indigenous life in the Adirondacks. And that would be largely Mohawk and then Abenaki people. Abenaki people are Algonquin language group, so they're not related to Iroquois people, but they are related to us as other first people, Ongahomwe, of this continent. And we shared that space of the Adirondacks with them. So in this, building out this Life in the Adirondacks exhibit around Indigenous life, it was very important to us that we're advising that, yes, we honor our deep past in the region, but we also focus on our continued presence and on the vitality of our own communities. One of the things I really loved that they did, which at first I just thought cynically was kind of flashy, modern technology, was they would have these videos with speakers, people, in a film loop, greeting people and saying hello and telling us who they were, like this young boy on the right who greets you in Mohawk and talks about his community. I've actually found those incredibly useful. When I watch children go through the exhibit, For one thing, they're always drawn to moving images and video because of our lives today and their familiarity with screens. But seeing a young person, someone their age from our community, not, talking about the past and not representing, but talking about, visiting the park and growing up in the region, and seeing several people of different ages talk and explain something about their lives really has an impact on them. It makes real something that they're being told, but now they're seeing it, hearing it, kind of experiencing it. Similarly, we have exhibitions like that explaining Three Sisters agriculture. And now we have during the summer, we're starting a Three Sisters garden outside on the campus so that one could actually see these corn, beans, and squash growing together. There's a lovely documentary video, short video, but very engaging to kids because it features kids on the Akwesasne Reservation at the Freedom School, which is a Mohawk first language program. And so they're going to elementary school, but everything is in Mohawk. And again, the emphasis on cultural vitality and not that museums are simply storehouses of the stuff of the past. There are old things, of course, and as an old culture, we are proud of those things, but we're also proud of our contemporary world as well. There are exhibitions that celebrate and explain contemporary art forms like basketry and pottery making. And you can have workshops and hands-on things with people from the community. And again, for a lot of people, this has the same kind of effect of bringing it into the present, making it somehow real, making it personal, and hearing from what is typical in museum studies talk to refer to the source communities of ethnographic materials. And here, Mohawk and Abenaki people are the source community of objects being displayed in the museum. And I think having those people there talking about them, their relationship to them, generations of family who have made baskets or lacrosse sticks, it brings those things to the present in a really rich way. We also happily collect contemporary Indigenous art, and here I'm just going to go through quickly some pieces. The couple, Babe and Carla Hemlock, he's an expert maker of carver and traditional objects like this cradle board. Carla works a lot in fabric and quilting, and here you have this idyllic celebration of nature on one side, and then the threats against our environment on the back. You have a boy and his mother both having to wear gas masks. You have oil derricks and smokestacks in the background about environmental degradation. So this isn't just keeping alive a traditional art form, but making commentary through it. You have this beaded medicine mask by Marlena Thompson. Yes, we're in an age of medicine masks, but this one calls attention. It's called Medicine for the Stolen Children, and it calls attention to those children that were taken by force to residential boarding schools throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. Here you have a splint basket version of a mask made by Carrie Hill. Both of these are Mohawk artists that want to bring in traditional forms of making, beadwork, splint work, and put them in conversation with objects that have become, unfortunately, commonplace in our day and age, but with that commentary. I think of the spikiness of that one mask, and when I see those design or images of the pathogen itself, of the COVID that little spiky ball. And then orange is a color we often associate with, there's an orange shirt wearing day during the school year where people wear orange to remember and call to mind those children that were sent to those boarding schools. We also have people like Dave Fadden doing this beautiful mosaic style painting of a native figure, or Benjamin Benedict, this a remarkable traditional carver who's not traditional, carving a traditional object, but this really virtuoso piece is of the raven there with the stones that's made from a single piece of black walnut, if one can believe it. And so there's just putting on display, the talents and the focus of some of our artists. These are two beautiful pots, which Natasha Smoke is riffing on traditional archaeological style Haudenosaunee pots, but connecting them to commemorating and memorializing victims of the residential school system, and also celebrating survivors of that school system. Just to bring it closer to home for myself, I became involved also at Syracuse, nearby on the sacred lake, Lake Onondaga, with a completely repurposed center. It was once known as Sainte Marie among the Iroquois, and it was a kind of faux French fort celebrating missionary work by the Jesuits among the Onondaga. And when it closed down a number of years ago, the interpretive center was turned over to the Historical Society, and they invited the Onondaga Nation nearby and scholars at Syracuse University and elsewhere to contribute to making an interpretive center about what we wanted to celebrate. And that was our Great Law of Peace. And so now we have the Scano Great Law of Peace Center, which is a really different experience for school children because it comes from a completely Indigenous, a completely Haudenosaunee perspective, and tells the story we understand of ourselves, right? How we got there and what our challenges have been, and so on. So what I'm hoping all of this means, and this is where maybe I'm at my most idealistic, or maybe my most mistaken. I hope not. But I am hoping that at this point we have experienced something what I would call an indigenous turn in these things, where increasingly institutions, universities, museums, galleries are paying attention to the part played by Indigenous people in US and Canadian history. And I actually think it's hard for me to imagine going back to those old days where you simply never heard about anything Indigenous. You didn't learn it. People will say, oh, this is really interesting to me. Why did I never learn about the boarding schools? Why didn't I learn about forced removal, etc.? I don't think we'll be able to say that anymore. It is my hope that there's some kind of turn, an Indigenous turn in museum studies, in US history telling, that simply acknowledge our presence and our part in those worlds, in those structures, and our continued place in this society. So I will end there, but as I said, I'm hopeful that such things are not just fads, but they rather mark a point from which it would be very difficult indeed to retreat. So with that, I'm happy to take some of your questions, and I say, a great thank you. Thanks.
Well, Scott, thank you very much. Everyone, I'm David Kahn. I'm the Executive Director of the Adirondack Experience, and I'm going to be moderating the Q&A portion of this evening's presentation. Before we get to the questions, I do want to mention that this presentation tonight is part of an ongoing series of programs related to a forthcoming permanent exhibit that we're working on, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild, that's going to feature the arts of the Adirondacks over the past several hundred years. And this permanent exhibit is going to open on July 1, 2023, which is right around the corner. And there will be many of the wonderful things that you saw this evening in Scott's presentation in that permanent exhibit, as well as other materials, as well as Scott mentioned, the Adirondack Experience is actively collecting materials that relate to the original occupants of the area in which the museum is located. I might mention too that our next presentation in this series will take place on February 28th, and Takis Walter will be speaking. So I hope you'll all join us then. Well, Scott, much to discuss and think about here. And I might first forward a question by one of our viewers who mentions the New York Times' 1619 project. And the person was wondering, should there be a similar project focused on Native American history that will help everybody sort of come to terms with and realize what the story has been here in the United States, and something that would be of benefit for the entire population and Native Americans in particular?
Sure, it's a great question, and I think with the 1619 project, my takeaway on that has been to remind us of how early slavery is, a problem in our country's history, and how therefore foundational it is to concerns. I think there's somewhat of an inverse with Native American history, which is, as I said, it's seen as foundational because we're surely the people here when Europeans arrive. But as I said, we're kind of ushered off the stage very quickly, and that whole notion of the vanishing Indian. I always say, the question is not why did they vanish? It's who vanished them. Um, we're being told they're vanishing in the 18th century. Well, there are still hundreds of thousands of indigenous people in North America, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who haven't yet died from diseases brought by Europeans and war, etc. And yet you'll get paintings in 19th century America as early as the 1830s saying the last American, the last Indian. And I'm like, that kind of aspirational vanishing is a long, long part of US history. And I think that's what we need to be reminded of, is that we continue on into this day. I worked with a group of other scholars when I was still in Chicago, back in 2015, thereabouts. We put together a book precisely for teachers that don't have this background, called Why You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians. And we each scholar, an expert in a certain field, did a different chapter from the earliest colonial period right up to the present. So if you're wondering, you're teaching World War II and think Native America has nothing to do with this, there's a whole chapter on that, or the Civil War, or the Civil Rights era, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, there are increasingly books by Native scholars that are trying to fill in those historiographic gaps that have been left. But I think that I don't know that the push would be as concerted as 1619, but in terms of competing with it with a year and a title, but it would be to say the familiar phrase for Native scholars is "we are still here," and that reminder alone. will hopefully allow people to ask questions. Well, what has happened in between, 1492 or 1776 or whatever your yardstick is, and now that we're not learning about Native people.
Thank you. Scott, you mentioned, you used the term the indigenous turn. Could you comment on how major museums created by Native Americans have contributed to this hopefully felicitous indigenous turn? In other words, say the National Museum of in Washington, and maybe even the Pequot Museum. And there are lots of other tribal museums created not quite on the scale of the Pequot Museum, but that are trying to present a different story.
Sure. No, and I think that's an important part. That I really do hope that people, when they travel around this country, if they are interested in Indigenous history in some form or culture, that they'll look up and see wherever they are, if there is a tribal museum there, because those museums are usually quite new. It's only been recently that our communities have had something like resources to build such places, but they tell our stories from our perspective. Um, Again, not just kind of propaganda or anything that's cynical, but simply explain how we see ourselves. I remember being really struck by that when being in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, at the Zebewing Museum for the Sagamore Chippewa tribe. And they have this beautiful state-of-the-art museum, which they curated, which tells their story. And it's not just all a story of conflict with whites. That's part of it because it's part of Native history, but it's very much a part of how they understand their long history on this continent. And there are dozens and dozens of these museums now. And so I think that's a real change. The other is, I think, for large museums like the National Museum of the American Indian and other museums trying to reform their perspectives. One is the turn to indigenous source communities as the experts, so that you don't have to have a PhD in order to be an expert. You have to know a lot about your own culture. So, we want someone going to a clan mother in our community to find out information about our clan system today and so on and its rules, rather than going to some PhD in anthropology who's never really had much deep connection with our communities. So source communities as resources, that's an important part of it. And increasingly indigenous staff. It's only been recently that the Met in all its glory, has finally hired a Native American curator to curate that indigenous art that they're now recognizing as art rather than artifact.
Scott, a number of people have asked for your thoughts about particular museums. And have you been to the Fruitlands in Harvard, Mass? I've been there. I don't remember the Native American presentation, but somebody asked what you thought about that in the Swanee Museum in Pennsylvania. Any thoughts?
I don't know either of those museums from a Native standpoint. I don't, the latter one I'm not familiar with at all. I have to say I've been at the Fruitlands Museum, but it was probably too long ago that to have anything about Native America, at least that I was struck with. I remember attending a conference there in the late 90s, so now almost 30 years ago, but there was nothing about it that struck me as, so that may be part of, an expansion of their work. And you'll see this in different museums where suddenly people realize at a museum, especially ones dedicated to certain regions or events, there's Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, not surprisingly. And of course, until recently, it's never paid attention that it was, a disaster for Haudenosaunee people. The Erie Canal both promoted really vicious, and aggressive land grabs from our communities because it goes through the heartland of our nations. And so it puts a really big bullseye on every Haudenosaunee community. And there's nothing good for us about the Erie Canal. And so a museum purely celebrating it, but in our homeland, you know, it, to its credit, would belatedly recognize, all right, this is not an unalloyed good in history. But it is, for some people was disastrous and something they had to overcome, etc. But yeah, I don't, those two museums, I don't have much to comment on.
Okay.
Sorry.
Scott, here's a great question I'm going to read because I won't be able to do it justice otherwise. Earlier on, you said that the assumed viewer visitor to a museum is white. That directs the way the interpretive signage is written. Who should we now assume is the audience? Is there a way to make it neutral?
I think there is a way to make it neutral, which would be to assume that, let us say, not that the audience is native or non-native, but that the audience is hopefully diverse. And so that the audience doesn't necessarily see themselves as in a position of, well, we're the people that run the society and these are not. They may also feel marginalized or outside. And I think more what I would like there to be is the sense that the voice speaking to you from the museum is one rooted in the community which is being represented rather than being ventriloquized, right? So if something's telling you about Haudenosaunee culture, I hope that comes from a Haudenosaunee person, right? I hope that label was written either by or in consultation with a Haudenosaunee person. Similarly, I would want to have, Black perspective on, you know, African American life in the 19th century as freed people in parts of New York. What was that experience? I don't know much about it. So, was it unproblematic? I'd be surprised. But I think that the sense that the voice comes from the source community, whomever is being represented, is important to me. And as I said, with the presumed normative, white viewer is partly, as I said, the emphasis was always on the ethnic other, the other being not white. And so you don't, as I said, have museums that spend much attention to looking at settler life, unless they're about settlement per se, but they're rarely about interaction, is my sense of it. So yeah, there's a long way to go on those, and I think that one can, as I said, if not presume neutrality, then presume diversity.
Mhm. Scott, I'm going to take us just slightly off topic for a moment. I know that you seem to travel a lot and you go to all sorts of conferences around the world where these very same issues are being discussed. And could you just speak a little bit about that, how the situation here in America and the transformation in terms of what's happening in museums is or isn't happening abroad as well, in the relationship between Indigenous people and, the colonist populations that are now there and dominant?
Right. No, that's a great question. I think it depends on the nation state. So we have settler colonial nations, and that's where you had an indigenous population that was eventually overwhelmed, and I mean tremendously overwhelmed by like 90% of a non-indigenous population. And that would be places like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Those would be the Anglo settler colonial nations. But also the southern cone of South America, so Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, vastly European descendants there vastly outnumber indigenous peoples. And then you have, others that are mixed. Brazil is a settler colonial state, but it's not all white. It's white and black because of the enormity of slavery, chattel slavery there until 1888. So in settler colonial countries, this is a very different conversation in museums. Some are more forward thinking, but it's always dependent on the government. So I would say Australia and New Zealand have made, very similar kind of moves that you see in the US and Canada about trying to become more sensitive and aware of what these Indigenous or Aboriginal issues are. You have less so of that in South America. You still get a lot of Indigenous denial when I've been to Argentina, where people say, well, there just aren't any Indigenous people, which is simply not true. And, in Chile, it's very hard to say that when the government itself is using the army to fight the Mapuche people in southern Patagonia. You can't say that they don't exist, and yet we're fighting them. But that, of course, has an effect of how the government, which often is the sponsor of museums, wants that history represented. So it really varies. I would say in Europe, where it's a matter of sometimes colonial nations returning objects. You see that happening with Germany returning bronzes from Africa, from West Africa, where they were colonists, etc. I haven't heard of England being quick to give back anything, whether it be Powhatan's mantle or the Elgin marbles. There's still a sense that those things are going to stay in the British Museum or elsewhere. So it's a mixed bag, but you do see where you see the most proactive, I would say, would be Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States.
Mhm. Thank you. One person commented that there's only a relatively small percentage of the population that goes to museums. And so how do we reach all those other people with these stories?
It's true. I mean, I guess museums are not the only place. I think one thing is to make, say, to hold Hollywood and purveyors of stories and stereotypes more accountable for their work. Meaning, yeah, if you were willing to hire somebody to make sure that your Western or your Elizabethan costume drama is historically accurate, well then invest in some consultation with Native communities about conflicts or other parts of our history that you're representing, because those things have tremendous authority. We know they shouldn't, but they just do. And so I guess I do think that a tremendous amount of children are still exposed to museums, just if anything, because schools need to park them somewhere. There's that rainy day, just let them run amok in the museum. And you think, God is nigh, because are they going to learn anything? I don't know. But at least what's being offered should be accurate. But I agree, it's a tremendous larger problem. I do think, you get a lot of outlets that can do good. I've seen wonderful documentaries and shows that collaborate with communities on PBS and other instances. Again, may not be reaching as many viewers as some other channel, but at least it gives me hope that there's an attentiveness to getting it right. That there's a real recognition that it hasn't been in the past, and maybe we should be doing a better job.
I'm going to sort of switch around a question that somebody posed, but it kind of gets to a little bit of what they were asking, how is it, do you think, that these crazy dioramas still exist everywhere and that they haven't been covered up and removed? Is it simply inertia? Oh my God, it's going to cost a lot of money to replace that. Or is it a concern with a changing interpretation? I mean, sometimes, you mentioned the Natural History Museum in New York. They have those dioramas on all those civilizations from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, everywhere, which they're just insane, the way they're presenting these cultures. So what do you think is at the root of, the stasis, as it were, that these installations continue to exist after decades and decades and decades?
Yeah. I think money is the primary one, resources. I mean, the Natural History Museum in New York has spent millions of dollars to redo just the one hall on Northwest Coast material, and that's a substantial hall and an important series of exhibitions where they've reached out to indigenous people from those communities. That's wonderful, but that is millions of dollars and years of work, and that's an enormous museum. As you say, there are more than just indigenous cultures to address, and so I think it is just that, the overwhelming tide. And at one point, you think, well, they built the thing, but interests were different then. I don't know how many people, I always find, I bet it's harder to raise money for an anthropological or natural history museum than it is for the Met.
Hmm.
People like paintings, they like the Met Gala, things like that, that I'm
Hmm.
confused by. And I think, well, they want some fancy, shiny object that redoing the hall of, natives of the Southern Cone, just not going to get them that oomph. So,
Maybe. So one last question for you. Has the National Museum of the American Indian been influential in any way, in terms of how Indigenous peoples are presented, or how museums elsewhere in the country present their history?
I think its very presence and its aspirations have been tremendously influential. Um, it's not clear that it's always met those aspirations, but and that's because a lot of things are in its way at times too. But in general, I would say its continued focus on Indigenous people telling an Indigenous story or stories is a high watermark, and one that set a different standard in museum going when it opened in 2004.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're at the end of our time here. So, Scott, again, thank you very much for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts with our audience. And once again, please join us for our future programs in this series, and visit our website to learn more about the upcoming exhibit, Artist Inspiration in the Wild. And hey, if you want to be one of those fancy donors like the ones that Scott was referring to, you can actually contribute to the exhibit on our website. You can sponsor a painting there. Hey, sky's the limit. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being here with us, and good night. Thank you again, Scott. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye bye. I want to